You have to ask yourself why the palm trees of Florida are suddenly the backdrop for the fate of Eastern Europe. We are watching a spectacle, a carefully curated theater production staged not in the sterile, bug-swept rooms of the State Department, but in the gilded, velvet-roped halls of Mar-a-Lago. The mainstream media is feeding you the headline they want you to swallow: a meeting for peace, a handshake for hope, a dialogue to end the bloodshed. They show you the photos of Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky standing side by side, smiles plastered on like cheap wallpaper, and they tell you that diplomacy is back in style. But if you pause the frame, if you look past the flashbulbs and the scripted press releases, you start to see the cracks in the narrative. This isn't a diplomatic summit between two heads of state operating on equal footing. This is a summoning. This is a debtor being called into the office of the bank manager to discuss the terms of foreclosure, and the air in that room isn't filled with hope, it is thick with the scent of leverage. Let's be real about what is actually happening down in Palm Beach. The location itself is a message. By forcing Zelensky to come to Florida, to the Winter White House, Trump is establishing the hierarchy before a single word is spoken. This is home turf advantage taken to the extreme. It signals to the world, and specifically to the Kremlin, that the power center has shifted away from Washington, D.C., away from the institutional bureaucracy that has been funneling billions into the Ukrainian furnace, and into the hands of one man who treats geopolitics like real estate development. Zelensky knows this. You can see it in the way he carries himself. The defiant war hero persona, the man in the olive drab t-shirt who demanded ammunition instead of a ride, seems to have shrunk. He is no longer the darling of the globalist cocktail circuit. He is a man realizing that the credit card has been maxed out and the new management is auditing the books. The narrative we are being sold is that Trump is the peace candidate, the dealmaker who can fix in 24 hours what the establishment couldn't fix in 2 years. He talks about optimism. He talks about common ground. But pay close attention to the specific phrasing he uses. He says he has no deadline for a deal. That phrase should send a chill down your spine. No deadline is not the language of urgency, it is the language of a siege. When a dealmaker tells you there is no deadline, what he is actually saying is that he can wait you out. He is saying that he has the time, the resources, and the patience to let you bleed until you accept whatever terms he puts on the table. For Zelensky, time is the one luxury he does not possess. Every day that passes is another day of infrastructure pulverized, another day of territory cemented under Russian boots, and another day where the Western patience meter ticks closer to zero. By removing the timeline, Trump effectively puts a vice grip on Kyiv. He is telling them that the American cavalry isn't coming to the rescue anymore. The cavalry is now negotiating the price of the saddle. We need to talk about the timing of this. Why now? Why, after months of stalemate and the meat grinder of the Donbass, is there suddenly this high-profile pivot to negotiation? Is it because the battlefield reality has changed, or is it because the money has moved? You have to wonder if the return on investment for this war has finally dried up for the people who actually pull the strings. The defense contractors have emptied their old stockpiles, they've secured their new contracts for the next decade, and the stock prices of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin have already seen their peaks. Perhaps Ukraine has served its purpose as a clearinghouse for outdated NATO weaponry and a testing ground for new drone technology. Now that the R&D phase is over, the board of directors, the real power behind the throne, is ready to move on to the liquidation phase. Trump isn't just there to stop the shooting, he's there to oversee the bankruptcy proceedings. And look at the optics of the optimism Trump speaks of. Optimism for whom? Certainly not for the Ukrainian nationalist who believes in reclaiming every inch of Crimea. That dream died the moment the checkbook was closed. The optimism Trump projects is likely the optimism of a man who sees a way to pivot the United States out of a financial black hole while claiming a political victory. He gets to be the peacemaker, the anti-war hero who stopped World War III, while quietly handing over a chunk of Europe to the Russian sphere of influence. It's the classic bait and switch. The public cheers for the end of the dying, while the strategists in the back room are carving up the map with a red pen. We are likely looking at a Korean solution, a frozen conflict, a demilitarized zone, and a permanent scar across the continent. But unlike Korea, there won't be a 50-year commitment to protect the border. This feels more like a preamble to abandonment, dressed up in the finery of a diplomatic breakthrough. There is a deeper layer here that nobody on CNN or Fox News wants to touch. They treat this meeting as an isolated event, disconnected from the broader shadow war. But you have to ask, what is the quid pro quo this time? We all remember the perfect phone call, right? The one that got Trump impeached the first time around. It's ironic, almost poetic, that the two main characters of that drama are back in the same room, but the roles have reversed. Back then, Trump needed a favor from Zelensky to get dirt on Biden. Now, Biden is a ghost, fading into the wallpaper of history, and Zelensky needs a favor from Trump just to survive. Do you really think Trump has forgotten? Do you think a man who holds grudges like collector's items has wiped the slate clean? Not a chance. The pressure being applied in Florida isn't just about geopolitics, it's personal. It's a settling of scores. Zelensky is being forced to kiss the ring of the man he once tried to maneuver around. The humiliation is the point. It's a public disciplining of a client state that thought it could play domestic American politics and win. Furthermore, the mention of Trump calling Putin immediately after this meeting is the tell. In standard diplomacy, you talk to your allies, you form a coalition, and then you approach the adversary. Trump flips the script. He talks to the victim, sets the terms, and then calls the aggressor to close the deal. This implies a level of coordination or, at the very least, a mutual understanding between Trump and Putin that bypasses the traditional NATO structure entirely. It suggests that the framework for this peace was likely drafted in Moscow and Palm Beach long before Zelensky's plane even touched down in Florida. Zelensky isn't a negotiator in this triad, he's the messenger. He's been given the terms of surrender, packaged as a security guarantee. And the scary part? He has no choice but to take it. The European Union is fracturing, their economies are stagnant, and without the American security umbrella, they are toothless. Trump knows this. Putin knows this. And deep down, looking into the mirror in a guest suite at Mar-a-Lago, Zelensky knows it too. Let's dig into the no deadline concept again because it is the most dangerous four-letter phrase in this entire scenario. In the world of high finance and distressed debt, which is Trump's native language, when you tell a distressed asset holder that there is no deadline, you are effectively freezing their liquidity. You are paralyzing them. By refusing to set a timeline, Trump creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, uncertainty breeds panic. Investors pull out. Soldiers lose morale because they don't know if they are fighting for a victory next month or a stalemate in 10 years. The Ukrainian population, already battered and exhausted, begins to fracture. Internal political rivals to Zelensky start to smell blood in the water. This is psychological warfare disguised as patience. It destabilizes the current regime in Kyiv without firing a single shot. It prepares the ground for a leadership change, perhaps someone more pragmatic, someone more willing to accept the loss of the Donbass as the price of doing business. Is that the plan? To squeeze Zelensky until he pops, or until he is replaced by a puppet who will sign the document without reading the fine print? We also have to consider the silence of the other players. Where is the outrage from the neocons? Where is the screaming from the democracy or death crowd in the Senate? Their muted response is suspicious. It suggests that the memo has gone out. The wind has changed direction. The establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call the permanent bureaucracy, has decided that the Ukraine project is entering its sunset phase. They aren't fighting Trump on this, they are letting him take the heat for the inevitable collapse. If the peace deal is ugly, if it involves massive territorial concessions, Trump takes the blame for losing Ukraine. If it works, the establishment pivots to the next conflict, Taiwan, perhaps, or Iran. They are hedging their bets. Trump thinks he is steering the ship, but he might just be the captain chosen to navigate the Titanic through the ice field because nobody else wants their name on the manifesto when it goes down. The moment Zelensky leaves the frame, the real work begins. We are told that Trump intends to call Vladimir Putin immediately following the Florida summit. Let's not pretend this is a standard diplomatic courtesy call. This is the closing of the loop. In the world of high-stakes triangulation, you don't talk to the adversary unless you already know what the outcome is going to be. The sequence of events is critical here. First, you squeeze the weaker party, Ukraine, to define the maximum concessions they can swallow without collapsing. You get their capitulation in private, perhaps sealed with a handshake over a Diet Coke. Only then, with the deed to the property effectively in your pocket, do you call the other heavy hitter to finalize the transfer. This call to Moscow isn't an interrogation, it's a confirmation. It's Trump saying to Putin, the kid is ready to play ball. Now, let's talk about what I get in return. We have to look at this through the lens of the reverse Kissinger strategy. This is the theory that has been circulating in the dark corners of think tanks for years, but nobody wants to say it out loud on cable news. Back in the 70s, Nixon and Kissinger went to China to isolate the Soviet Union. Today, the skeptical mind has to ask, is Trump handing Ukraine to Russia to isolate China? Think about it. The obsession of the America First movement isn't Moscow, it's Beijing. They view Russia not as an ideological enemy, but as a potential counterweight, a resource-rich giant that has been pushed into China's arms by Western sanctions. By brokering a peace deal, even one that sacrifices Ukrainian territory, Trump might be betting on pulling Putin away from Xi Jinping. It's a cynical, cold-blooded calculus. Ukraine becomes the sacrificial pawn to break the Sino-Russian alliance. If this is the play, then Zelensky never stood a chance. He's fighting a war for national survival, while the men in the room are playing a game of global risk where nations are just colorful pieces on a board. And what about the nature of this peace? We keep hearing the word neutrality. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? Switzerland is neutral. Austria is neutral. But for Ukraine, forced neutrality is a death sentence for sovereignty. It means demilitarization. It means a government that requires a stamp of approval from the Kremlin. The security guarantees that Trump might offer are likely to be as flimsy as the paper they are written on. Remember the Budapest Memorandum? The skeptics among us know that neutrality in this context is just a polite euphemism for sphere of influence. The Iron Curtain isn't being torn down, it's simply being moved a few hundred miles to the west. Trump isn't stopping the war, he's formalizing the conquest. He's validating the rule of force, signaling to every dictator with a tank division that if you hold on long enough, the West will eventually get bored, the budget will run out, and a dealmaker will come along to legitimize your gains. There is also the personal dynamic between Trump and Putin that cannot be ignored. The mainstream media obsesses over collusion in a clumsy, political way, but they miss the psychological mark. It's not about blackmail, it's about admiration. Trump sees in Putin what he wishes he could be, a leader unencumbered by a Congress, by courts, by a pesky media. They speak the same language of oligarchy. When they get on that phone, they won't be discussing human rights or the Geneva Convention. They will be discussing zones of control, energy pipelines, and legacy. It's a conversation between two bosses dividing up the turf. The silence of the transcripts from these calls will be deafening. We will never know exactly what was promised. Did Trump agree to lift sanctions? Did he agree to unfreeze the Russian assets currently held by Western banks? Those assets are the bargaining chip nobody is talking about. Billions of dollars, sitting in limbo. If Trump hands that money back to Putin as part of the deal, it is the heist of the century, disguised as diplomacy. Furthermore, we must consider the timing relative to the battlefield. Russia has been grinding forward, taking heavy losses but securing land. By stepping in now, Trump freezes the lines exactly where they are. This benefits Russia immensely. It allows them to consolidate, to dig in, to Russify the occupied territories without the harassment of HIMARS rockets. It saves Putin from the embarrassment of a long, protracted stalemate that could destabilize his regime. In essence, Trump is throwing Putin a lifeline. Why? What is the quid pro quo? Is it just about the peacemaker Nobel Prize ego trip? Or is there a deeper alignment? Perhaps it's about energy. The global oil markets are manipulated by a cartel. Russia is a key player. Trump wants low gas prices to keep the American voter happy. Is Ukraine the price of $2 per gallon gasoline in the Midwest? It's a terrifying trade-off, the freedom of 40 million people for cheap fuel at the pump. But in the world of the skeptic, that's just standard operating procedure. While we focus on the handshake between Trump and Zelensky, we are ignoring the corpse in the corner of the room, the European Union. If you want to talk about the skeptic's view, you have to realize that this war was never just about weakening Russia, it was about disciplining Europe. Specifically, It was about breaking the economic spine of Germany. For decades, the German economic miracle was built on a simple formula: a cheap Russian gas combined with high-end German engineering. That marriage made Germany a global powerhouse, a rival even to American industry. And then, overnight, that marriage was annulled. Let's talk about Nord Stream. The pipeline explosion. The greatest act of industrial sabotage in history. And what happened? Silence. The investigation was quietly shelved. Why? Because the answer is too uncomfortable for the alliance to bear. A skeptic looks at the result: Germany is now forced to buy liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the United States at 4 times the price of Russian pipeline gas. American energy companies are making record profits selling gas to our own allies, effectively deindustrializing Germany. Factories in Bavaria are shutting down or moving to, guess where? The United States. This war has successfully transferred wealth and industrial capacity from the Rhine to the Rust Belt. Trump knows this. He loves it. It fits perfectly into Make America Great Again. By ending the war now, he locks in this new status quo where Europe is an economic vassal of the US, dependent on American energy to keep the lights on. Look at the political landscape of Europe right now. The unity they preach is a facade. Behind the scenes, the right-wing populists are rising. Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, the AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France. Trump isn't just negotiating with Zelensky, he is signaling to this new bloc of European leaders. He is building a nationalist international. These leaders are tired of the war, tired of the sanctions that hurt their own farmers and truckers. Trump is betting that by the time this peace deal is signed, the liberal establishment in Brussels, the EU headquarters, will be powerless. He is effectively bypassing the EU bureaucracy and dealing directly with nation-states again. This is the dismantling of the post-Cold War European project. And what about the refugees? Millions of Ukrainians have moved into Poland, Germany, and the UK. Initially, they were welcomed. But now, the social fabric is tearing. Housing crises, strained healthcare systems, wage suppression. A skeptic asks, was this mass migration encouraged to destabilize European social cohesion? It creates a permanent underclass and fuels the very right-wing movements that align with Trump. The peace deal likely won't include a mechanism for these people to return. They are the new demographic reality of Europe. Ukraine is being depopulated, its best and brightest drained away to serve as low-cost labor in the West. This isn't just a war, it's a demographic harvest. Now, let's pivot. Let's stop looking at the flags and start looking at the ledger. Because if you want to understand why this war started, why it lasted this long, and why it's ending now, you have to follow the money. And I don't mean the aid packages approved by Congress. That's chump change. That's the taxpayer husk being thrown into the fire. I'm talking about the real money. The reconstruction money. The privatization money. The trillions of dollars in assets that are about to change hands under the guise of rebuilding Ukraine. War is a racket, General Smedley Butler told us that a century ago, but today, it has evolved into a sophisticated financial instrument. The destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure, its power plants, its bridges, its factories, is a tragedy for the people living there. But for global investment firms, it is an opportunity. It is creative destruction on a national scale. You cannot build a shiny new, Western-owned infrastructure grid until the old, Soviet-era one is blown to bits. And who is lining up to do the rebuilding? It's not the local Ukrainian mom-and-pop construction crews. It's the behemoths. It's BlackRock. It's Vanguard. It's the massive engineering conglomerates like Bechtel and Halliburton. We know that Zelensky has already met with Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. They've set up the Ukraine Development Fund. The media calls it aid, a skeptic calls it a foreclosure sale. In exchange for the capital to rebuild, what is Ukraine putting up as collateral? Sovereignty? State-owned enterprises? The incredibly fertile black earth that feeds half of Europe and Africa? There is a very real possibility that the post-war Ukraine will be a nation where the government owns nothing, and foreign corporations own everything. The deal Trump is brokering might include clauses that mandate the privatization of key industries. It's the shock therapy of the 1990s all over again, but this time, the patient is already in a coma. Let's talk about the resources. This is the part of the story that gets buried on page 10. Ukraine isn't just wheat fields. It sits on some of the largest deposits of titanium, iron ore, and lithium in Europe. Lithium, the new gold. The essential component for every electric vehicle battery, every iPhone, every piece of green tech the West is obsessed with. Donbass, the very region being fought over, is rich in these minerals. Do you think it's a coincidence that the fiercest fighting is happening on top of the most valuable dirt? If Trump brokers a deal that partitions Ukraine, who gets custody of the mines? If the East goes to Russia, Putin corners the market on strategic metals. If the West keeps a chunk, American corporations get the contracts to extract it. This isn't a war for democracy, it's a hostile takeover bid for a mineral portfolio. Consider the debt trap. The billions of dollars in weapons sent to Ukraine, did you think that was a gift? Read the fine print of the Lend-Lease Act. It creates a debt obligation. Ukraine is now indebted to the West for generations. How do you pay back a debt when your economy is in ruins? You pay in assets. You sell off your energy grid. You sell off your water rights. You allow Western GMO giants to take over your agriculture sector, replacing local farming with industrial monoculture. The peace deal that Trump is cooking up in Florida will likely include the payment schedule for this debt. Zelensky isn't just negotiating a ceasefire, he's negotiating the terms of his country's indentured servitude. The winner of this war isn't Russia or Ukraine. The winner is the syndicate of creditors who now own the title deed to an entire nation. And let's look at the military-industrial complex, MIC. Why stop the war now? Why not 6 months ago? Why not 6 months from now? A skeptic would argue that the war has served its primary financial purpose. The old stockpiles of 1980s and 1990s weaponry have been cleared out of NATO warehouses. They've been sent to the shredder in the Donbass. This has created a vacuum that must be filled with brand new, high-tech, high-margin orders. The contracts for the replacement weapons have already been signed. The Raytheons and Lockheed Martins have their order books filled for the next decade. The consumption phase of the war is over, and the production phase is secured. Continuing the conflict now yields diminishing returns. It becomes too risky, too expensive, too unstable. It's time to cash out. The MIC is happy to let Trump play peacemaker now because they've already made their quarterly numbers. They are ready to pivot to the next threat, the China threat, which requires a whole different class of expensive naval and aerospace weaponry. Ukraine was the clearinghouse, and the Pacific is the new showroom. There is also the question of the grain. Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. Control over that grain is control over food prices, which means control over political stability in Africa and the Middle East. Who will control the ports in the New Deal? If Russia keeps the coastline, they hold the famine switch for half the planet. If the West keeps Odessa, the grain flows, but the profits go to the Western agro-giants who will consolidate the farmland. We are witnessing the corporate consolidation of the food supply chain. Small Ukrainian farmers are being wiped out by the war, leaving the land open for massive corporate buyouts. When the smoke clears, look at who owns the deeds to the fields. I guarantee you, the names on those papers won't be written in Cyrillic, they'll be LLCs registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Even the reconstruction of the cities is a grim opportunity. Smart city technology, 5G surveillance grids, digital ID systems. A war-torn country is the perfect sandbox to test new technologies of control. They don't have to retrofit old infrastructure, they can build the panopticon from scratch. Ukraine could become the prototype for the WEF's vision of the future, a digital, cashless, surveillance state built on the ashes of the old world. And who sells the tech? Silicon Valley. The same people who censor your news feeds are the ones who will be wiring the new Kyiv. Is this the freedom they promised? Or is it just a transition from Russian tanks to Western algorithms? So, when you see Trump and Zelensky shaking hands, don't just see a political agreement. See the invisible ink. See the transfer of wealth. See the divvying up of the spoils. The skeptic knows that in geopolitics, there are no good guys, there are no bad guys, there are only closing costs. And the people of Ukraine? They are just the tenants being evicted so the developers can knock down the building. The deal in Florida isn't about saving them. It's about finalizing the acquisition. Let's play out the scenario of what happens inside Kyiv the day after the peace deal is announced. The cameras will show relief, but the backrooms will be a slaughterhouse. Zelensky is currently useful as a wartime figurehead, but in a peace scenario where Ukraine loses territory, he becomes a liability. He becomes the face of defeat. The skeptic predicts a night of long knives within the Ukrainian political elite. The rivals, Zaluzhny, Poroshenko, the mayors, are sharpening their blades. They will blame Zelensky for the bad deal to save their own skins. Trump knows this. He might even be counting on it. A chaotic change of government in Ukraine makes it easier for the West to install a technocratic, compliant regime that focuses on paying back debts rather than nationalistic fervor. And speaking of debts, let's look at the green reconstruction narrative. You hear the EU talking about rebuilding Ukraine as a green steel hub, a leader in renewable hydrogen. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. It's a resource grab. They want to use Ukraine's land to build massive solar and wind farms to export energy to Western Europe, while Ukrainians themselves pay premium rates. They want to turn Ukraine into the battery of Europe, digging up the lithium and destroying the local ecology so that Berlin and Paris can feel good about their carbon footprint. This isn't reconstruction, it's environmental colonialism. The Green Marshall Plan is a Trojan horse for seizing vast tracts of agricultural land for energy production. Furthermore, we haven't touched on the organized crime pivot. With billions of dollars of aid flowing in and a demobilized army of angry, traumatized young men with weapons, Ukraine is at risk of becoming a superstate for organized crime. We saw this in the 90s after the Soviet collapse. The weapons we sent will be sold on the black market. The expertise in bomb making and drone warfare will be hired out to cartels and warlords globally. A skeptic asks, is the West preparing for the inevitable blowback? Or are the intelligence agencies secretly planning to use these networks? The hero of today becomes the terrorist or gangster of tomorrow. It is the cycle of empire. Finally, look at the cultural erasure. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine is being dismantled, priests arrested, churches seized. This is a spiritual war as much as a kinetic one. By severing the spiritual tie with the Russian Orthodox Church, the West is attempting to surgically alter the cultural DNA of the nation. It is a forced westernization, replacing thousand-year-old traditions with consumerism and secular NGOs. The peace will bring McDonald's and Netflix to every corner of the Donbass, but it will leave a spiritual void that will be filled by resentment for generations. You have to understand that modern warfare is not just about capturing hills or cities, it is about data. It is about research and development. For the last 2 years, Ukraine has not just been a battlefield, it has been the world's largest, unregulated, live-fire testing laboratory. The military-industrial complex didn't just send weapons there out of the goodness of their hearts. They sent them there to see what happens when American tech meets Russian steel in a high-intensity environment. They needed to know if their javelins actually work against reactive armor. They needed to test the limits of Starlink in an electronic warfare jamming environment. They needed to train their AI targeting algorithms on real human movements, not simulations. And now? Now they have the data. The experiment is complete. The terabytes of combat data have been uploaded to the servers in Virginia. The R&D phase is over, and that is a massive, unspoken reason why the peace talk is suddenly allowed to happen. Think about the drone warfare evolution we have witnessed. Before this conflict, drone war was about predators circling over deserts, controlled by guys in shipping containers in Nevada. Now, it's FPV drones. It's cheap, kamikaze swarms. It's naval drones sinking flagships. This war has rewritten the textbook on 21st century combat. The Pentagon has learned everything it needed to learn about the obsolescence of the tank and the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier. Continuing the war now offers diminishing returns on intelligence. In fact, it starts to become a liability. Why? Because if you keep playing your hand, you show your enemy too much. You don't want Russia, and by extension, China, to learn too many of your tricks. You want to save the really good stuff, the next generation tech that is being built right now based on the lessons from Donbass, for the big one in the Pacific. This brings us to the pivot. The skeptics have been saying this for years: Ukraine is a distraction, China is the target. The US military is currently suffering from a massive munitions shortage. We have burned through decades of 155mm artillery shells. We have depleted our stocks of precision-guided missiles. The generals know this. They are looking at the logistics charts and sweating. They know that if a war kicks off over Taiwan tomorrow, the US Navy would run out of long-range anti-ship missiles in less than a week. This is the terrifying reality they hide from the public. Trump's push for peace isn't just about saving lives, it's about stopping the bleeding of the American arsenal. He's being told by the brass that we need to hit the pause button, restock the shelves, and pivot the supply chain away from European land warfare and towards maritime dominance. Ukraine is being sacrificed so the empire can reload for the next fight. But there is a darker element to the weapons flow, the black hole phenomenon. Interpol, Europol, and even reckless whistleblowers have all hinted at it. We have poured tens of billions of dollars worth of small arms, stingers, and night vision goggles into a country with a history of corruption and organized crime. Do you really believe every single rifle ended up on the front line? Or are we going to see these weapons surfacing in the hands of cartels, terrorists, and insurgents for the next 20 years? History tells us the answer. We saw it after the Balkans. We saw it after Afghanistan. The blowback is inevitable. A skeptic has to ask, is this a bug or a feature? A destabilized world buys a lot of weapons. If American-made anti-tank missiles start blowing up armored cars in Mexico or convoys in the Middle East, guess who gets the contract to replace the vehicles and upgrade the security? The same companies that made the missiles. It is a self-licking ice cream cone of violence and profit. And let's look at the nuclear bluff. For 2 years, we've been told that Putin is crazy, that is on the verge of launching a tactical nuke. The media whipped us into a frenzy of fear. Armageddon is coming, Biden said. But now? Suddenly, with Trump in the room, the nuclear temperature drops? What changed? Did Putin suddenly become sane? Or was the nuclear threat exaggerated all along to justify the massive spending? The skeptic looks at this and sees a pattern of fearmongering used to manufacture consent. They needed you to be terrified so you wouldn't question the $100 billion sent overseas. Now that the spending spree is winding down, the monster under the bed is being put back in the closet. It turns out the monster was never as scary as they said, it was just useful. We also have to scrutinize the biological aspect. Remember the biolabs? The media called it a conspiracy theory. They banned people for talking about it. Then Victoria Nuland sat before the Senate and admitted under oath that Ukraine has biological research facilities that they were worried would fall into Russian hands. Why was the US funding biological research on the Russian border? Why, when the war started, was there a frantic effort to scrub the data? As part of any peace deal, will there be an independent investigation into these facilities? Or will the peace agreement include a clause that seals those records forever? Trump knows where the bodies are buried. Does he use that information to expose the deep state, or does he use it as leverage to get them to back off his presidency? I won't release the files if you let me govern. That's the kind of deal a real skeptic suspects is happening right now. We've talked about tanks and missiles, but the real war, the one that will continue long after the ink dries on the peace treaty, is the shadow war. The New York Times recently dropped a bombshell that the skeptic community has known for years. The CIA has set up a dozen secret bases along the Russian border. These aren't just listening posts, and they are forward operating bases for the next generation of hybrid warfare. When Trump talks about peace, does he mean closing these bases? Absolutely not. If anything, the peace deal will legitimize the intelligence presence. Ukraine is becoming the Langley of the East, a giant, militarized listening post pointed directly at Moscow. Let's discuss that Starlink factor. Elon Musk. A private citizen who effectively controls the nervous system of the Ukrainian military. There was a moment when Musk reportedly turned off the coverage to prevent an attack on the Russian fleet. Think about the implications of that. We have entered an era where tech oligarchs have veto power over sovereign state military operations. Trump and Musk are close. Is it possible that the peace plan was actually stress-tested by Musk's data? A skeptic has to wonder if the terms of the ceasefire are being dictated not by generals, but by the coverage maps of satellite constellations. If you control the internet, you control the war. And if you turn it off, the war ends. It's that simple. Then there is the threat of asymmetric terror. As the conventional front lines freeze, the war will move into the shadows. We've already seen car bombs in Moscow, assassinations of bloggers, sabotage of railway lines deep inside Russia. Who is funding this? Who is training them? When the official army stands down, the partisans stand up. But are they really partisans, or are they assets of Western intelligence agencies kept on a loose leash to keep Putin unstable? A peace deal might stop the artillery, but it won't stop the car bombs. In fact, it might increase them. We are looking at Assyrianization of the conflict, where officially there is peace, but unofficially, special forces and mercenaries are waging a dirty war in the dark. We also need to talk about the black market of data. Ukraine has been a testing ground for facial recognition software, Kyiv AI, and Palantir's targeting systems. Every Russian soldier's face, every phone call, every movement has been catalogued. What happens to this database? It is the most valuable dataset on the Russian military in existence. It will be sold, traded, and used to train AI models for the next 20 years. The privacy of the battlefield is dead. And this technology, tested on Russians, will eventually be turned inward. The surveillance grid built in Kyiv is the prototype for the surveillance grid coming to a city near you. While your eyes have been glued to the map of Kharkiv, while you've been arguing with strangers on the internet about who owns Crimea, do you know what you haven't been looking at? Your own backyard. The genius of the Ukraine narrative is that it served as the ultimate distraction from the slow-motion collapse of the American interior. It is the classic magician's trick, a look at the flashy explosion in the right hand so you don't see the left hand picking your pocket. Let's talk about the border. Not the Ukrainian border, the American border. It is a bitter irony, Almost a sick joke, that the American political establishment has spent endless energy, money, and rhetoric on the sanctity of Ukraine's borders while deliberately dissolving their own. Why? A skeptic asks, is it incompetence, or is it design? While we were funding the border guards of a foreign nation 5,000 miles away, millions of unvetted individuals poured into Texas, Arizona, and California. The resources used to prop up Kyiv could have built the wall 3 times over. They could have hired 10,000 border agents. They chose not to. They chose to protect the sovereignty of a client state while surrendering the sovereignty of the homeland. Was Ukraine the moral cover? We are defending freedom, they shouted, while the very concept of a nation-state was being eroded at home. And then there is the economy. The Inflation Reduction Act. The Putinhof price hike. Remember those slogans? They blamed the skyrocketing price of eggs, gas, and housing on the war. We have to pay more to stop Putin, they said. What a convenient scapegoat. The truth is, the printing presses were running hot long before the first Russian tank crossed the border. But the war gave them the perfect alibi. It allowed the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to hide their disastrous monetary policy behind a veil of patriotism. Don't complain about your grocery bill, citizen, it's for the war effort. They looted the value of your dollar, transferred the wealth to the energy sector and the defense sector, and told you it was your civic duty to be poor. Trump knows this. His entire pitch is economic nationalism. By ending the war, he removes the alibi. He forces the establishment to own the recession they created. We also witnessed the weaponization of the financial system. When the US kicked Russia out of SWIFT and seized their central bank assets, they crossed a Rubicon. They told the world, the dollar is not a neutral reserve currency, it is a political weapon. What was the result? Did Russia collapse? No. But the rest of the world took notes. BRICS exploded in popularity. Saudi Arabia started trading oil in yuan. The global south began dumping US treasuries. The war in Ukraine accelerated the de-dollarization of the world by a decade. Was this a strategic blunder by the experts in the White House? Or are there forces within the globalist structure that actually want to see the end of American financial hegemony to usher in a new, digital global currency system? A skeptic wonders if the destruction of the dollar's dominance was an intended side effect of the sanctions regime. Let's not forget the war on disinformation. This conflict gave birth to the most sophisticated censorship apparatus in human history. Under the guise of fighting Russian propaganda, the US government pressured social media companies to silence dissent, ban accounts, and shadow ban independent journalists. If you questioned the narrative, you were a Putin puppet. If you asked about the money, you were spreading disinformation. Ukraine was the testing ground for domestic information control. The tools they built to track Russian bots are now being turned against American citizens. The Disinformation Governance Board might have been paused, but the machinery is still running. The legacy of this war will be the normalization of censorship in the name of national security. And look at the cultural psychological operation. The blue and yellow flags in every bio. The virtue signaling. It was a mass psychosis event. people who couldn't find Ukraine on a map suddenly became fervent nationalists for a foreign country. It showed how easily the public consciousness can be hijacked and directed. It was a masterclass in manufacturing consent. Now that the programming is being switched off, now that the current thing is fading, watch how quickly the mob forgets. Watch how the flags disappear. It proves that the public support was never about genuine understanding, it was about conformity. And the people who engineer these narratives? They are laughing at how easy it was to make you care, and how easy it will be to make you forget. Finally, consider the timing of the peace relative to the US election cycle. The Democrats know the war is unpopular. They know the funding fatigue is real. They need this issue off the table before the next midterms or the next big political cycle ramps up. Trump stepping in to solve it actually helps the establishment in a weird way, it cleans up their mess. But Trump frames it as a victory. It's a symbiotic relationship. The Uni-Party needs an exit strategy, and Trump needs a win. They trade horses. The losers? The people who believed the lie that we would support Ukraine for as long as it takes. As long as it takes turned out to be as long as it was politically convenient. The domestic distraction is fading. The fog of war is lifting. And what Americans are about to see when they look around their own country is going to be shocking. The infrastructure is crumbling, the debt is insurmountable, and the social fabric is torn. The party is over, the bill is due, and there is no foreign boogeyman left to blame. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and if you listen closely to the melody playing in Florida right now, it sounds hauntingly like the tune played in Paris in 1973. We are witnessing the modern reenactment of the peace with honor strategy, Nixon style. Back then, the American public was exhausted. The Treasury was bleeding. The establishment needed a way out of Vietnam that looked like a victory but was, in reality, a managed exit. They signed the accords. They shook hands. They promised the South Vietnamese government continued support. And then? Then they cut the funding. They pulled the air support. And 2 years later, we saw the helicopters lifting off the roof of the embassy in Saigon. A skeptic looks at Zelensky today and sees the ghost of Nguyen Van Thu. He is the loyal proxy who believed the promises of a superpower, only to realize too late that superpowers don't have friends, they only have interests. We saw the same script play out in Afghanistan just recently. Do you remember the chaos at the Kabul airport? The desperate people clinging to the wheels of C-17s? That wasn't an accident, that was a liquidation. The US government spent 20 years and $2 trillion building an Afghan army that evaporated in 24 hours. Why? Because it was never a real army, it was a jobs program for defense contractors. Once the money spigot was turned off, the illusion collapsed. Is Ukraine any different? We have poured billions into their government salaries, their pensions, their logistics. The Ukrainian economy is on life support, fed by and for drip from Washington and Brussels. What happens when Trump pulls the plug? The structure is too heavy to stand on its own. The collapse, when it comes, will be framed as internal corruption or political failure by the Ukrainians, absolving the West of responsibility. We gave them the tools, they will say, they just couldn't finish the job. It is the perfect wash of hands. There is a cynical maxim in geopolitics, often attributed to Henry Kissinger, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. The Kurds know this. The South Vietnamese know this. The Afghans know this. And now, the Ukrainians are learning it. The pattern is always the same. The US encourages a local force to fight a rival power, Russia, China, communism. They flood them with weapons. They cheer them on as freedom fighters. But the moment the geopolitical calculation shifts, the moment the cost outweighs the benefit, the proxy is dropped like a hot rock. Trump isn't inventing a new foreign policy here. He is simply executing the traditional American closure of a distressed franchise. The skeptic knows that the handshake in Florida is the beginning of the end. It is the severance package. Let's analyze the sunken cost narrative. For 2 years, the media told us, we can't stop now, we've invested too much. If we stop, Putin wins. This is a logical fallacy designed to keep you paying. In the world of venture capital, and make no mistake, this war is a venture capital project. When an investment goes bad, you cut your losses. You don't throw good money after bad. Trump, the businessman, looks at the balance sheet. He sees a stalemate. He sees a money pit. He decides to write off the asset. The moral obligation the media talks about? That doesn't exist on a balance sheet. To the people in charge, Ukraine is a distressed asset class that is underperforming. The pivot to peace is simply a portfolio readjustment. They are freeing up capital to invest in the next bubble, which is likely the conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We also have to consider the precedent this sets for the concept of sovereignty. By forcing Ukraine to trade land for peace, the West is officially validating the might makes right doctrine. We spent 70 years building a post-WWI order based on the idea that you can't just redraw borders with tanks. That era is officially over. We are returning to the 19th century Great Game. The great powers, the US, China, Russia, will sit in rooms and draw lines on maps, and the smaller nations will just have to live within those lines. The International Criminal Court, the UN Charter, The Hague, it's all theater. It's all meaningless when the big boys decide to cut a deal. Trump and Putin are effectively agreeing that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It's a return to the law of the jungle, dressed up in a tuxedo. And what of the security guarantees? We will hear a lot about this. NATO membership? Highly unlikely. It will likely be a porcupine strategy, arming Ukraine to the teeth so they can defend themselves, but without Article 5 protection. But wait, isn't that what we were doing before the war? Isn't that what caused the war? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result. A skeptic suspects that these guarantees are just words to help Zelensky save face domestically. They allow him to go back to Kyiv and say, we didn't lose, and we secured our future. But the reality is, without a direct American shield, Ukraine remains in the buffer zone, forever vulnerable, forever a playground for the intelligence agencies of the East and West to wage their shadow wars. So, where does this leave us? We have watched the handshake. We have analyzed the motives. We have followed the money. And the picture that emerges is not one of hope, but of cold, calculated restructuring. The 60-minute journey we have taken together leads to one inescapable conclusion: the war in Ukraine was never about Ukraine. It was a pressure valve. It was a money laundering operation. It was a testing ground. And now that its utility has been exhausted, it is being decommissioned. The meeting between Trump and Zelensky is the final act of the play. The audience, that's you and me, is supposed to applaud the peacemaker. We are supposed to feel relief that the threat of nuclear war has receded. But we must remain vigilant. Because while they are closing down the European theater, they are opening the Asian theater. The military factories are not shutting down. The production lines for missiles are ramping up, not down. The budget for the Pentagon is hitting record highs. Peace? There is no peace. There is only a change of venue. The forever war is not a specific conflict, it is an economic model. It requires a constant state of tension, a constant rotation of enemies, to keep the gears turning. Yesterday it was ISIS, today it is Russia, tomorrow it will be China. The names change, but the contracts remain the same. We must also confront the illusion of choice in our own politics. The Democrats started this war, and the Republicans are ending it. It looks like a fierce battle between two ideologies. But is it? Or is it a tag team wrestling match? One side ramps up the spending, feeds the complex, and creates the crisis. The other side comes in to fix it, consolidates the power, and pivots to the next target. The result is a ratchet effect. Government power always grows. Surveillance always increases. The debt always rises. Whether it's Biden or Trump, the trajectory of the American empire towards militarism and debt remains constant. They just argue over the speed and the branding. The skeptic sees the uniparty at work. The faces on the coins change, but the people who mint the coins never do. What is the future for the ordinary people? For the Ukrainians, it is a bitter winter of reality. They have been used and discarded. Their country is partitioned, their youth decimated, their resources mortgaged. For the Russians, it is a Pyrrhic victory, gaining ruined land at the cost of a generation and economic isolation from the West. And for us? For the American taxpayer? We are left with the bill. We are left with the inflation. We are left with a world that hates us a little bit more. And we are left with the distraction. Because while we were arguing about Donbass, our own liberties were eroding. The censorship infrastructure built during this war isn't going away. The digital surveillance isn't going away. The precedent that the government can seize assets and weaponize finance isn't going away. These are the permanent scars of the war, and they are on us, not them. Finally, look at the new world order that is solidifying. This peace deal is the admission that the unipolar moment is dead. The US can no longer dictate terms to TH.